Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Wednesday, July 31st, 2013, last day of July, hump day, middle of the weekday, starting the long, slow glide down to Pauhana Friday, and another hopefully relaxing weekend now that we're through Storm Flossie. Hardly anything here on Oahu. It did knock out power on Maui and Molokai, and apparently Molokai is still trying to pull together after that. Already there's another storm just off the coast of Mexico, Gil, that may be coming this way. So it looks like we're going to have a really rowdy hurricane season this year. Before I get into the show, I want to respond to Phyllis Schlafly's comment. Now, I find myself agreeing with a great deal of what she puts out on her program, but on this issue, I have to take exception. And I wanted to simply to point out all of these people running around saying that, you know, gays are bad or gays are wrong or gays are sinful and we shouldn't allow gay marriage are doing so out of religious prohibitions in these very, very ancient scriptures. And what you need to understand is the objection to gays just living together and being happy and not bothering anybody else all comes down to wealth and property. Because in ancient times, when there was a very high infant mortality rate, poor medical care, and people were dying off, your population, if you're a ruler or a priest, that population represents your wealth, and more is definitely better. More babies, more workers. More babies, more tax revenues. More babies, more people sitting in that church throwing coins into that collection plate. And so it was all about maximizing the birth rate. It's all about wealth. And because religion in those days was the dominant method of social control, do what we say and obey the king, or you will go to spend eternity in the dark places. We're going to send you to Cleveland, or Detroit, I guess now. And that's really what it's all about. But in a world of overpopulation, you know, there's a lot of countries saying we've got really too many people. And so this idea that we are enforcing heterosexual marriage and procreation on a population that is genetically predisposed against it really is impractical. And having studied this issue rather heavily, it is very clear that the larger the urban area, the greater the social stress on a population, the higher the per capita instance of homosexuality you will find. And what that suggests to me is homosexuality is a natural, built-in population reduction system inside the human gene. If it's getting too crowded, if people are going hungry, if people are under stress and beating each other up, you tend to see a greater prevalence of homosexual children. That's the cause. It's genetically determined. It's not a choice. They're designed that way. They're coded that way. And as a result, homosexuals have just as much right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as anybody else. Not only that, they are necessary to control what could easily become an out-of-control human population. And so on this one, I have to disagree with Phyllis Schlafly. If they're happy, leave them alone. Really, it doesn't really matter. It's not like they're going to, you know, their particular proclivities will be inherited by their children, obviously. So just leave them alone. Really, just leave them alone. Alrighty, the phone lines are open. 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Man is in the control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble. A reminder that Ellen Brown, author of Web of Debt and the Public Banking Solution, will be joining us in our third hour. Gee, I can't even imagine what it is we're going to be talking about here. And, of course, Friday in the third hour, Claire will be joining us for her unique perspective on the world. I'm in communication with Ben Swan's people. We're still nailing down a date, probably next week, for him to come on our show and talk about his new media venture, continuing the tradition for very honest, factual reporting that he started over at Fox 19 in Cincinnati, and now he's gone out on his own, and we wish him a lot of luck. He's struggling to get this out there, but obviously a man of integrity and honesty, and we need to support him any way that we can. Now, turning to the corporate media They were wailing and caterwauling just as our opening music was playing about the demand to find the Benghazi terrorists. Congress is trying to fire up an investigation into Benghazi, and of course they're not looking at whether there are reasons to doubt the official story. Oh, no, we absolutely believe the official story. And we want to know why we can't find the Benghazi terrorists. Well, have you tried central casting? Because that's where I would go to find them. Because I'm absolutely convinced Benghazi was a staged stunt to give Obama a crisis that he could manage and look good for the election. And it got out of control because some of the SEALs did not obey the order to stand down and not interfere. And the local population around Benghazi heard the gunfire and said, "Yeehaw, they're kicking out the Americans, let's join in." And this carefully choreographed, stage-managed piece of theater went wildly out of control, turned into a complete riot. The ambassador and his people were killed, and now Obama is basically trying to cover it all up. And so if you want to find the Benghazi terrorists, again, go over to Central Casting, because I think that's where they got them. Apparently, there is a nationwide protest set for August 6th. And the theme of this nationwide protest is to impeach Obama. I don't think Congress has the spine to do it. They're completely co-opted both by Israel and by Wall Street's financial interests, but it would be kind of a nice way of getting the public feeling out into the public eye. The more people who show up for this, and the more we cover it here on the independent media, the more we're going to be telling the rest of America, yeah, it's now socially acceptable to say, let's get rid of the Fuhrer. In fact, let's get rid of the entire government. They're not working for us. I heard a very interesting story about how the president is saying, if the Congress doesn't fund Obamacare, I'm going to shut down the government. And my answer to that is let them. Whether it's the failure to raise the debt ceiling or the rest of it, let's let the federal government shut down, and let's all Americans see what it's like to not have to be constantly filling out those federal forms, not having the NSA looking at what we're doing, not have TSA grab our crotches at the airport. Let's go for a couple of months without a federal government and see if life gets better for the ordinary American people, and I'm willing to wager a plugged Turkish piaster it would, which is why they won't shut down the federal government. Because they're scared we might actually learn to like it. Remember what happened in Belgium? Their federal government collapsed and they didn't get around to starting a new one for close to 2 years. The people were having such a good time without it. We're going to grab a quick phone call here. Dan in Oregon. Aloha, Dan. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, first of all, thank you for accepting the call. I just want to add some additional information in regard to your population reduction in regards to the homosexuality and so forth. Another issue that was raised by the Catholic Church, which follows your line of thinking, was the act of suicide. In the earlier times, people would say, if we're going to heaven, why wait? And they would commit suicide. And finally, the church would say, hey, wait a minute, we're losing a lot of people. And this doesn't make sense. And thus the church went around and made it a sin. They have since modified their position, but made it a sin where if you did commit suicide, you couldn't receive the final sacraments, or could you be buried in the Catholic cemetery. I just wanted to say that, Mike, and I'll hang up and leave it as that. Thank you.
Okay, well, I seriously doubt people were voluntarily committing suicide just to go to heaven, but back in those ages, the oppression of the people under feudalism and serfdom was so extreme that people were thinking about committing suicide just to get out from under being flogged, from working hard and being allowed to keep nothing for it, and that was the reason the church put that little rule in there. Now, when I die, I don't care where I'm buried. In fact, I don't want to be buried. I want to donate my body to science because medical students can always use a good laugh. But it's all about control and exploitation. That's what all these rules were set up to do. We got to take a break for commercials, and we will be right back. Aloha, America, and welcome back to the show. And despite all these attempts to draw our attention away from the scandals, Obama's out there saying, look, if you'll all just agree to forget about NSA Gate and IRS Gate and DOJ Gate and Plum Gate and Benghazi Gate and all your kids coming back dead from these wars to force the world back onto Bretton Woods, I'll fudge the economic figures to make it look like the economy's doing better. such a deal here. But these scandals are not going away because despite the best efforts of the United States Congress investigators to sort of look only at the official report and not actually talk to the wronged people, remember, this whole IRS thing is continuing to blossom up. The FBI has not actually talked to any of the targeted dissident groups, so they can go before Congress and say, we saw no evidence of wrongdoing, because they're pointedly trying as hard as they can not to see it. There are new developments coming out of the NSA spy scandal. Apparently, one of the tools they use is called X-Keyscore, where with a single typing of your email address or phone number and the click of a mouse button, they can get real-time access to your ongoing internet activity. They're watching everything that you do. So, of course, don't forget, take some of these words from the Department of Homeland Security's monitored keyword list, like Allah, anthrax, Bletchley is on the list. Whole bunch of bizarre things you wonder why they're on there. But just make sure that you're using them in all your online communications, and that'll drive those automated scanning systems completely bonkers crazy. A little note, you probably heard that there was going to be an informal congressional hearing on the NSA spying on law-abiding American citizens. And by informal, it means nothing they said or did would have any binding in law. It's basically a chance for them to stand up there and say, yes, we're working on the problem by having a meeting. Well, apparently that meeting has now been canceled. No explanation. My guess is that some of the people behind that informal congressional hearing got late-night phone calls replaying their phone calls to Fifi's phone fantasies in the dead of night. And that, of course, is the real danger of the NSA spying, not just on ordinary American people, but on our officials, on our members of Congress, on judges. They got the goods. They've got the goods to blackmail people, and more observers are thinking that is the most likely explanation for why Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court Roberts did that sudden 180-degree change in his position on Obamacare. The court was getting ready to vote it down as being unconstitutional, and then Chief Justice Roberts said, well, I guess if we twist it this way and we put some paint stripes over here and a little bit of chrome on this side, we could sort of say it falls underneath the Commerce Act. And then he promptly left the country for a 2-week vacation so he could dodge the reporters. And because his earlier statements were very clearly, adamantly opposed to Obamacare, his sudden reversal suggests that some kind of influence was brought to bear on him. It makes you go, We've been talking about those fusion centers that are being set up to sort of pull together all of these disparate databases that are being maintained by all these different funded agencies and try and make heads or tails of them. We know all of these stories coming out about how completely innocent people are being raided on the basis of these fusion centers. There was one case where a SWAT team kicked down the door of a home because the family's records of purchases at the local home and garden store included Grow-Lux bulbs, which are bulbs that are designed to support plant life indoors, and a lot of other gardening materials. Aha! The Fusion Center concluded these people were growing marijuana in their basement, and it turned out they were growing non-GMO vegetables for their own consumption, on their own property, in their own home. And because the Fusion Center said it had to be a drug operation, nobody actually showed up at the door with a warrant and knocked and said, we'd like to see what you're growing with all this stuff. They just sent the SWAT team to kick down the door, caused a lot of property damage, went on down, and they say, oh my goodness, these people have tomatoes! They've got cantaloupes! They're non-GMO! This cannot be allowed to stand! And again, I've been pointing out time and time again, they're data mining social media, your Facebook pages, MySpace, Twitter, all of this stuff. What is that? Picasa. Everything that you put online to share with everybody else is being data mined. People lie on social media, especially if they're trying to find a hot date for the next weekend. They exaggerate how much money they make. They exaggerate the possessions that they own. They exaggerate the size of their house. They exaggerate the size of certain portions of their anatomy. This is not a reliable source of raw intelligence, and yet this entire fusion center NSA spy is resting on this provably unreliable source of intelligence information. There are now 78 of these fusion centers all across America in a country that only has 50 states. And they're not producing reliable information. They're producing mistakes at hideous taxpayer cost. By the way, the Department of Homeland Security, which is out there saying we're going to watch everything you law-abiding American citizens are doing. We're going to watch it in real time, everything that you do online. They're now admitting they have lost track of almost 1 million foreigners living, working inside the United States of America. Can't find them, don't know where they are. Now, I remember the good old days when we were being told there was a terrorist threat, and we were told it was always foreign terrorists who are coming into this country to cause mayhem. And the result of all of this is a spy network that watches you, the law-abiding American citizen, but somehow just can't seem to keep track of something like 1 million foreign nationals wandering around the country. Doesn't sound like the system is working. In fact, the reason it isn't working is twofold. One, they're not really looking for terrorists and criminals. They're keeping an eye on you, the serfs, whose labor props up this entire system. And we've already demonstrated with our NSA challenges, we've had 2 of them now, that anybody with the resources to develop their own encryption methodology will not be visible to the NSA. The NSA will know there's encrypted traffic there unless you bury it inside an image file with steganography, in which case they're not even going to know a message is there. So if the NSA really can't break the codes of anybody with the resources to develop their own code system, if they're only able to read encrypted traffic that uses the standardized mandated encryption, which is mandated and standardized so that the NSA can read it, then this system was never intended to go after criminals and terrorists. It's intended to keep watch on you, the slave population who represents the collateral that the U.S. government has pledged against all this borrowing they're doing from the Federal Reserve here. Apparently, another appeals court has ruled that the government can grab the cell phone location records on you without a warrant. They can just ask the phone company, just tell us where this person has been. And every modern cell phone has a built-in GPS. Even if your phone does not have a system where that GPS data is presented to you, ostensibly as part of the 911 system to know where you are if you dial 911, every cell phone has a GPS chip, and between that and the cell towers, which track your location based on where you are in the cellular system, the phone companies know every place you go, unless you take steps to isolate your phone from GPS and the cell towers with these privacy cases. And the appeals court has ruled the government can grab that information to know where you went without a warrant. So if you're sitting on a local city council and you're trying to vote a contract in, you could get a call saying, if you don't give the contract to my buddy, we're going to tell your wife you're stopping at the adult bookstore on the way home from work every day. Hello, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, getting back to the NSA spying on everybody, and I mean everybody, the McClatchy News Organization has formally asked the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, whether U.S. intelligence agencies were monitoring the content of cell phone calls between a McClatchy freelance reporter and sources in Afghanistan. Now, first of all, and again, it is a violation of the Fourth Amendment for the government to be monitoring the phone call of any U.S. citizen unless they are suspected of an actual crime. And worse, given how reckless the government has been with this data, the source in Afghanistan is being placed at great risk of harm or death by this kind of spying. And McClatchy's obviously justifiably upset at this. And we know this goes back to the revelation that the Department of Justice was scanning phone records for various corporate media organizations. It's designed to scare reporters away from investigating stories on their own. You know, the model is you come right back to the public relations manager for the candidate or the official or the government, and you take your little pre-written talking points, and that's what you report as the news. I was replaying an episode of Newsroom. I'm rapidly falling in love with that show. It sort of blows hot and cold on the writing. But they had a group of people who were on the Mitt Romney bus, tooling around New Hampshire. And that was the model. You just sit there, you get your turkey sandwich, and you get your talking points, and that's what you report as news to what's going on. And some of the reporters on this bus started asking questions about the issues, at which point they were simply kicked off the bus. If you want your ride on the bus or on Air Force One, you will take your talking points and you will report that as news. You won't dare go out and ask questions of the candidate or the politician, and you certainly don't go out and talk to anybody outside the government who might have contradictory information. What do you think you are, a reporter? You're part of the public relations propaganda machine, the Ministry of Truth, as it were. And McClatchy is very upset, and I'm sure all of the corporate media outlets are very upset because they already know they are losing audience and advertisers to the independent media. Because out here in the independent media, we are not beholden to large corporate sponsors. We are free to go out and look at the facts ourselves and present our analysis to you, the listening and reading public, without being influenced. The rules are very simple. We don't tell the advertisers what to sell, and they don't tell us what to write or not write. And these large corporate media organizations who unfortunately have become dependent on huge advertising contracts from places like Monsanto, we saw that in California with Prop 37, the pharmaceutical industries, they realize because of that, because they are constrained by political and financial influence, that they've lost the trust of the American people, and they're trying to figure out how are they going to get it back before they're simply driven out of business, as so many small-town newspapers already have, that we're not allowed to report on what's really going on. So McClatchy is kicking up a fuss, and I imagine certainly at these other media organizations that have come to understand they were being spied on, even though they had committed no crimes at all. That's what that Fourth Amendment is all about. Until you are suspected of an actual crime, until there is an accusation supported by oath or affirmation, meaning there's got to be a witness or some obvious piece of physical proof that you have done something wrong, the government is not allowed to conduct a fishing expedition in your home, in your car, in your computer, in your smartphone, any of it. And they've been doing it to all these corporate media outlets, which has shocked these corporate media outlets. We here in the independent media, we've known it all along. It's just part of the background noise now. But it does inhibit their ability to do their job at a time when they need to start actually going out and finding hard news to try and win their audience back. So they're getting upset about that. Meanwhile, Congressman Issa is out there saying that the Internal Revenue Service chief is simply stonewalling the investigation into what's going on, or what has been going on. And more information continues to surface that the IRS abuses went way beyond merely delaying and harassing Tea Party and Occupy groups seeking tax-exempt status for their foundations. We know that major donors to Republicans, including Mitt Romney, have been hit with disproportional amounts of audits and other forms of harassment. All of this is illegal. This kind of misuse of the IRS to go after political enemies was an article of impeachment under Richard Nixon. And I think it's time to ratchet the discussion up just a little tiny bit, because this IRS scandal has now awakened Americans that the IRS acts illegally, that they engage in criminal behavior. And this opens up an opportunity for us to pose another question to the American people. Is the IRS and the income tax itself actually legal? And the answer is no. I did a web search earlier today on 16th Amendment never ratified and found thousands, tens of thousands of entries. This is already well known out there. The original Constitution of the United States of America prohibits a direct non-apportioned tax on the American people. It's in the Constitution. An earlier version of the personal income tax was struck down by the United States Supreme Court based on that. So the money junkies, in the same year that they created the Federal Reserve System, which is itself unconstitutional, they ramrodded through the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, was voted through Congress and sent out to the necessary states. Secretary of State Philander Knox sent a letter to Congress saying that the amendment is now in effect. He didn't even use the word ratified. He said it's now in effect. And it turns out Secretary of State Philander Knox, probably no more honest than any of our more recent Secretary of States, lied. Nobody can actually document that the necessary required states actually ratified the 16th Amendment. And yet that amendment is the entire foundation for this idea that the IRS, a private corporation working as a collection arm for the Federal Reserve System, a private central bank that has unconstitutionally usurped the money creation authority granted to Congress by the Constitution, is a fraud. That's their entire foundation. Oh, everything we do is justified by the 16th Amendment. But there are some problems. First of all, nobody can document that it was ratified. Requests by tax advocacy groups to the IRS to document that, in fact, that amendment was ratified are ignored. There have been all these various groups that are holding these annual conventions in Washington, D.C. to discuss this, and every year they invite spokespeople from the IRS to come on over and lay out the documentation. Certified copies of the bills of ratification from the necessary states, and every year the IRS simply refuses to show up. Their attitude is the only legal reply we have to make is our enforcement actions when we kick down your door and we take your house. That's their entire attitude. We don't have to prove anything. We're above the law, which seems to be an attitude that pervades not only the IRS but the Federal Reserve itself. We have Alan Greenspan on video saying the Federal Reserve is answerable to no federal government authority. They see themselves as the supreme governmental authority, a private bank running the country here. Now, there are some other problems with the 16th Amendment. First and foremost, there is one judge in one case, Judge James C. Fox, who in a case Sullivan versus United States states quite clearly in the court record that on examination the 16th Amendment failed ratification. Sadly, it was not a tax case. He was citing the non-ratification of the 16th Amendment as justification for legal enforcement of laws that didn't actually pass just because out of long use and habit they've sort of become assumed to be part of the law of the land. In other words, we got away with it this far, we're going to go on doing the same thing. There was a United States Supreme Court decision, Stanton versus Baltic Mining, that ruled the 16th Amendment, even had it been ratified, did not, in fact, confer any new taxing authority on the U.S. government. For one thing, the original constitutional prohibition against a direct non-apportioned tax is still in effect. It was never explicitly repealed. And under the rules guiding the Constitution, in order to keep it internally self-consistent, in order to change that prohibition, that provision of the Constitution has to be explicitly repealed. We pass an amendment repealing Article 1, Section blah, blah, blah of the Constitution, which prohibits direct non-apportioned taxation. That's never been done. And a lot of people are already aware of this stuff. We got people like Joe Bannister with his website, Freedom Above Fortune. We've had him here on the show here. And in an innocent, naive time before, people would have said, oh, that's nonsense. The government would never lie to us about something that important. But after Saddam's nukes, yeah, people are ready to believe it. We got to take a break for commercial. America, welcome back to the show. And I did want to recap on one thing. I keep making the statement that the Federal Reserve System itself may be unconstitutional because the Federal Reserve is a privately owned central bank. It is not a part of the government. It appears nowhere in the Constitution. It's no more federal than Federal Express. Now, the Constitution vests the United States Congress with the authority to create the public currency as a public utility. It was a model that had worked for the colonies prior to the imposition of King George III's Currency Act, which forced the colonies to conduct all their business using banknotes borrowed at interest from the Bank of England, which was the primary cause of the American Revolution. Now, because the Constitution does not authorize Congress to delegate that money creation authority to a private outside bank, it should take an amendment to change that. But because of all the problems they'd had with that 16th Amendment, including having to lie about its ratification, the proposed 17th Amendment, which would have authorized the Federal Reserve, was dropped. And they simply passed it as a congressional measure over the Christmas holiday, when people who were opposed to it were at home. And it's unconstitutional. The Constitution very clearly says the government creates the money supply. Banks can issue their own banknotes, but you're not forced to use them because there is a public currency that is a public utility, which is the silver dollar or the equivalent in gold or the claim checks thereof. The paper notes in circulation were not the money. They were claim checks for the money. The money was the silver coinage. It should have taken a constitutional amendment to change the Constitution to allow transferring of the government's money creation authority to a private central bank. But because of all the problems they had with the 16th Amendment, they didn't want to take a chance on the 17th Amendment. So they passed it as the Federal Reserve Act. They were originally going to call it the Third Bank of the United States, but they realized people were going to remember the problems with the first and second banks of the United States, so they changed the name, the Federal Reserve System, to fool ordinary Americans into thinking that, yes, this was part of the government, and yes, they were covered by the Constitution's money creation authority. But they aren't. They are not. So do your own research. Go on out and take a look. Look at Joe Bannister's website, Freedom Above Fortune. Look at Aaron Russo's documentary, America from Freedom to Fascism. Do a web search. You will find literally tens of thousands of pages on this subject. And the advantage right now we have is that with all of America now well aware that the Internal Revenue Service has been acting outside the law, being used for political purposes. It's not about revenue raising, certainly not with a government that can't balance its books. It's all about control and repression. And the time has come to ask if the entire system itself is actually legal under the Constitution, and the answer is no. Now, something else we want to be focusing on right now and getting out there in public and talking about, of course, is 9/11. We're coming up on yet another anniversary of that false flag hoax to launch the century of unending war that was proposed by the neocon Project for the New American Century, the New Reichstag Fire, or as the project itself called it, the New Pearl Harbor. And there is a lot of noise going on about it. The government has still got their online shills trying to muddy the waters and poison the well. But there are four aspects of this case which absolutely make it obvious that this was a hoax. It was as fake as the Benghazi raid. It was as fake as Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. And, of course, that goes to the first one, of course, is the very obvious controlled demolition of World Trade Center Building Number 7. Now, Richard Gage over there at the Artisan Engineers for 9/11 Truth has been mounting this huge ad campaign. They've got banners and bus placards up in several cities. They're collecting donations to get the word out there. Because Americans in this post-Saddam's nukes era have come to understand the U.S. government controls us with lies, fraud, and deception. We are the most lied to people on the face of this earth. And there is no explanation other than controlled demolition for how that Building 7 just collapsed right into its own footprint. Every controlled demolitions expert who looks at that video says, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. There's no other explanation. Because of that, in the official U.S. government report on 9/11, Building 7 isn't even mentioned. According to the official U.S. government report on 9/11, only the two big towers came down. They don't mention Building 7 because they can't explain it. An airplane didn't hit it. There's reason to think that the airplane that was shot down over Pennsylvania was supposed to hit Building 7, because if you go back to the No Day Brothers documentary on 9/11, the firefighters are saying they have been told a third airplane is on the way to the World Trade Center. But the best laid plans, as they say, and the most likely explanation is that the crew of that flight, Flight 93, regained control of the aircraft from whatever was being used to remotely control it. And had they landed, of course, what was on the plane, the truth on the plane, would not have lined up with the official story, and it had to be shot down. That left Building 7 still needing to come down, already being pre-wired with explosives, thermite cutter charges, and they still had to bring it down and say, oh, it was a fire. And nobody's buying that one. So that is a main problem with that right there. We have photos of the scars on the load-bearing members of buildings showing the remains of these slant demolition cutter charges that used thermite to cut through those beams. The slag is still there. These are not scars from cutter torches used after the collapses, because cutter torches cut steel by feeding oxygen into the flame, so it burns away. That's where all the shower sparks come from, and they don't produce this kind of slag. Plus, if you're cutting a beam to get rid of it and get it out of the way, you go straight across, the shortest distance to save time and fuel. You don't cut it at a slant. That is the mark of a demolition charge. Another issue that's unequivocal, of course, is that the BBC and even Fox News, we found the video on that one, announced that World Trade Center Building 7 had collapsed 26 minutes before it actually happened. We have video of the BBC reporter in New York reporting on the disaster, and Building 7 is still behind her, and the lower third says, Building 7 has collapsed, and it's still standing behind her. They were following a script. Somebody was late on the switch to bring down building number 7, and word didn't get back up there saying, delay this part of the story. And, of course, for me, the part that really makes it obvious that this whole thing was a fraud was George W. Bush sitting in that school in Florida reading about pet goats. And Andy Card comes in and speaks to President Bush, and according to President Bush's own words, that was the moment at which he realized the United States was under attack. And he goes on sitting there, reading about goats, waiting for his speech that he's going to make about how, the war on terror and so forth. And all around him are these Secret Service detail agents who don't take a step to protect the life of the president, even though that is their only job. They're not worried about how it's going to traumatize the kids. They're not worried about anything. And so if you look at it from the point of view of the Secret Service protective detail, they're in a school, a difficult security situation. There is, in theory, an unknown number of airplanes flying over the United States, crashing into buildings. Bush's presence at that school was announced in the corporate media 3 days ahead of time, so the terrorists potentially know he's there, and there's an airport only 4 miles away from the school. Now, we've all seen the video of how fast the Secret Service moved when Reagan had the attempt on his life. They're just trained to move without thinking. And yet in this case, they didn't grab George Bush. They didn't throw him in that armored limousine, the Beast. They didn't start driving in a random direction to foil a possible inbound. They didn't do anything. The dog did not bark. From the Secret Service in action, it's obvious they knew ahead of time Bush was not going to be a target. And that means they knew what the targets were going to be. Back after news and commercials. I know we got a caller waiting on the line. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2 here. And before I go to the phone lines here, I just want to wrap up on this 9/11 situation because we are coming up on another anniversary. There are going to be some new conventions, get-togethers, both in New York and Washington, D.C. about 9/11, which if you're near them, you should go on over and say hello. And already we're seeing the government online shills try and come out with the usual distractions. Just what did Larry Silverstein mean when he said pull it? And, of course, inevitably, there was no plane at the Pentagon. And just trying to kookify the whole story. But if you go back and you look at those 4 aspects I mentioned to you, the way Building 7 just collapsed straight into its own footprint, which is physically impossible unless it is a controlled demolition that severs all of the load-bearing members at exactly the same point in time. The evidence on the wreckage of the Twin Towers of cutter charges and thermite. The fact that BBC and Fox News and even some others reported on the collapse of Building 7 26 minutes before it actually happened. And the fact that by its inaction, the Secret Service protective detail around President George W. Bush obviously knew he was not a target. And the only way they could know that is they knew what the targets were going to be that day. Just stay focused on those. Don't get lured away with other distractions about hypersonic weapons or micro nukes or all this other junk they throw out there to try and keep the issue confused. Do your own research. Go on out. There's all kinds of web pages on this stuff. Make your own decision and talk it up, because right now in this post-Saddam's weapons of mass destruction environment, Americans are ready to accept that the government lies to them about major things. And it's been going on all along. There were no torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin to escalate the war in Vietnam. There was no Spanish mine in Havana Harbor that destroyed the USS Maine that tricked America into the Spanish-American War. Pearl Harbor was not a surprise. They goaded Japan into it following an 8-step plan by Office of Naval Intelligence Lieutenant Commander Arthur H. McCollum. Roosevelt knew the Japanese were coming to attack and did not tell the Hawaiian commanders, so it looked like a surprise sneak attack to trick us into war against Nazi Germany. All wars begin with deception, up to and including weapons of mass destruction. We must invade Iraq. And if you, like me, are sick and tired of our young people coming back home in those cheap metal boxes, the time to stand up is now. The time for polite restraint is over. Patriotism does not mean using the American flag as a blindfold and going along with what you know are lies out of a misguided sense of loyalty to authority figures. It is time to get angry. It's time to get in their face. There's an article over at whatreallyhappened.com where C-SPAN is having to deal with more and more people calling into their shows and screaming about how they know 9/11 was a hoax and a fraud. They know the reasons for all these wars are lies and a fraud. It's really all about the petrodollar and Bretton Woods. And you need to do that. You need to get in the face of anybody speaking these lies. Senators, representatives, anybody you can get to and say, I know you are lying about this. We have to shake their confidence. Because right now they're not going to be able to escalate the current war situation along any further unless they can come up with a new big bang to scare us back into obedience. And the more we let them know that we know they are lying, the less likely they are to try a new false flag. Although they're getting desperate. There's no question about that. Alrighty, the phone lines are really loading up. We're going to start with John in California. Aloha, John. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, good afternoon, Mike. I've never called your show before, but I've listened quite a bit, and I've got to say, you pack quite a bit into 3 hours, and I am almost never disappointed.
Well, thank you.
And you're a very good show. And that's pretty hard to do, to keep a jam-packed 3-hour time slot. So, what I wanted to do was just compliment you and commend you on your discussion, as brief as it was, about the IRS, because most of the reporting that I hear, just attempts to do a very cursory surface treatment of a small part of the surface of the dealings of the IRS with the Republican contributors and also the Tea Party people, and that's just such that doesn't do justice to the whole fraud of the IRS, and you were getting at it very well. It doesn't do justice to the supposed death sentence or life sentence that was given to Mr. Irwin Schiff several years ago. He got 15 years, but he was 83 when he got the sentence, so it's unlikely he'll survive through that. And there's other people who have died. This guy, Richard Simcannon in Texas, earlier in the early 2000s, and it had to have been it seemed like it had to be a stress-related type of thing. And then there's a whole host of others too. I can't begin to count all the problems, but I really appreciate you doing that. I just to supplement your last final remarks about 9/11. I've been a member of Richard Gage's website, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, That's www.AE, Architects Engineers, AE911truth.org. That's probably a good place for anyone to start that already hasn't done too much research, because I can vouch for it. Anyway, whatever that's worth.
No, that's a good source. I mean, these are people who, for a living, design and build buildings and know what it takes to bring them down. And these are all people who have put their professional reputations on the line to say the official story could not work. Those World Trade Towers were designed and built to withstand the impact of a passenger jet, because it has, in fact, happened before in New York. And so these buildings are designed to survive the impact of an airplane. In fact, they were designed to survive the impact of a heavier aircraft than the 757, let alone come crashing all the way down to the ground here. And it's complete nonsense. And Richard Gage has just been amazing. He's done a lot of work. I had the very great pleasure of meeting him on the 10th anniversary of 9/11 in New York. And, of course, we've had him here on the radio show. And he's not raving, fanatical, wacko kind. He's a very serious, practical, dedicated individual. I think a lot of architects and engineers were offended by the idea that buildings they design and build to survive airplane impacts could come down that easily. Or in the case of Building 7, that this building, which because it housed federal offices, was actually built stronger than the usual building codes, could be brought down by, a couple of office fires here and there. And
the Twin Towers. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Just to follow up, you're saying the Twin Towers, I think it was sometime in the early 70s, right after they were built, they were given an award for by the American Society for Civil Engineers on how strong they were and how well built they were and well designed they were. I shouldn't say built, because New York is a mobbed up area, so some people will say, well, they left out several pieces of the metal or something like that.
Well, no, they didn't, because, you're always keeping an eye, especially for a showpiece building like this. I mean, everybody knew the World Trade Towers were going to be the icon of New York. And so everybody wanted these things to be beautiful and great and well built. Even the mob said, yeah, let's do this one up right. And they didn't cut any corners, and we've got all this photographic evidence of just how strongly these buildings were built with that central core. And the situation. The government has actually lied about how the buildings were built to try and sell their idea of the pancaking floors, and yet we've gone back to the original blueprints and found that no, what was in the official report on the collapse of the big towers was an outright fabrication. They made it look weaker than it actually was. And it's just lies from beginning to end. And
that's correct.
We've got to get angry about it. They killed a lot of people to try and sell us a war.
That's it. And I think the big problem, Mike, that we have to deal with, and any of us have to deal with, who are trying to get out the truth, is that a lot of people just don't want to know the truth. They don't want to deal with it.
I think those days are gone. Those days are gone, and we'll be right back after this. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And in response to that last caller saying that most Americans don't want to know, those days are gone forever. Americans have come to understand that they need to know what's going on. Now, maybe federal government employees who are dependent on that check really would rather not find out they're working for the Fourth Reich. But for ordinary Americans, especially those who live their lives playing by the rules, paying their taxes, paying their mortgage, doing all of the things they were told they were supposed to do, and still had their lives ruined, they have come to understand they have a legitimate need to find out just what the heck happened to what used to be the greatest nation on earth. And so this issue of 9/11, which launched all of these wars of conquest, 9/11 was the justification for it all. We've got to invade Afghanistan for 9/11. We've got to invade Iraq for 9/11. We've got to invade Iran for 9/11. And we already have on tape George Bush admitting Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. They're bad guys. We're going to go get them. And that's why 9/11 is so very important. We're going to take a phone call here. Scott in Wisconsin. Aloha, Scott. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, I'm glad that you're talking about this. Hey, you posted, I would direct everybody to what you posted, which I thought it was just awesome and shocked me, was 9/11 of the deception. Watch that video, and it'll blow you away. Mike, you're right on the trail, brother. And there's three things that I want to say that people will see if they watch that video. Number one, what about the two witnesses that were in Building 7 that survived it? There's one on there they've survived the collapse of that building, and they tell what they heard. They heard the whole bottoms being blown out.
Yeah, they got out of the building just as it came down. They weren't in the building when it actually collapsed, but they had just walked out the door when it came down. They heard explosions. The firefighters on that No Day Brothers documentary, 9/11, they heard explosions. We've got explosions caught on tape. In fact, on the video that I posted on World Trade Center 7, just to show you that the corporate media was in on this thing. The version that was shown on TV, if you watch it very carefully, that little box up on top of the building, I think it's the top of the elevator shaft. It's called the penthouse, but I think it's just the hardware for the elevators. It just sort of pops off magically, and then the building comes down. And it turns out what they cut out is, just at the point that little box on top starts to come down, you can clearly hear the sound of an explosion, and we found that raw, unedited tape, and we posted it to whatreallyhappened.com. So this whole thing was being stage managed right from the start.
Well, you're exactly right, Mikey. Because what about every morning? I'm not sure. I think it was from 2 to 5 or 3 to 5 in August. There were bands going in there when everybody was gone from the towers. What were they doing in there at that time?
Well, supposedly, let me tell you, supposedly it was a renovation, but whatever it was so secret. The work crews had one entire elevator dedicated just to them. They could use that elevator. Nobody else could. Nobody can find any paperwork for the supposed renovation that was going on. People inside the tower said whatever they were doing, they were drilling into load-bearing members because the vibration was so great, dust was coming on down. Yeah, there was a lot of work going on in the World Trade Towers for weeks and weeks ahead of 9/11. And, of course, the last weekend before 9/11, the building electricity was shut off completely, disabling all the various alarm systems inside there. And you need to remember that the mayor of New York had his emergency response center in the World Trade Towers. He moved it over to Building 7, I think it was a couple of months before 9/11. And the most telltale story here involves a company called Zim Shipping Lines. This is Israel's primary merchant marine shipping company. It is part owned by the Israeli government. They had offices in the World Trade Towers. They broke their lease at huge financial penalty to move their office out of the World Trade Towers and over to New Jersey just weeks before 9/11. And so the evidence goes on and on and on. There was a company called Odaigo, which sells backbone services for instant messaging. And it's another Israeli company. They had an office near the World Trade Towers, and somebody sent that office a message. Before the airplanes used in the attack even took off, they received a message saying, "Get out of your office, something bad is going to happen." And the FBI went into Odaigo. They got the IP of the party that sent that warning message, and that was the last we ever heard of it. And don't forget that 4-part story on Israeli spying that Carl Cameron did on Fox News, in which a U.S. government official acknowledged there was evidence that linked these arrested Mossad agents, the so-called dancing Israelis, to 9/11, but that evidence was now classified by the United States government. So we've got the culprits. The U.S. and Israel together, CIA and Mossad together, pulled this thing off to anger Americans into declaring war on whoever needed to be declared war on.
And Mike, I'll just finish up, and I love you, brother. And you know what? The thing is this. The only way that I could see through this, and I believe you, and see through this situation is through the good Lord, and I'm not afraid to say that, because you got to see through the matrix of 2 words, of deception and delusion. And the only way that you can go and see through those is from the help from the big guy. So, Mike, take care, and you take care, and you be safe there, big guy.
All right, thanks an awful lot. When I was a kid, I was a magician, party magician, stage magician, and I actually paid for most of my college education as a magician. Nightclubs, the Magic Castle, even got to play up at the Playboy Mansion a couple of times, cruise ships, that sort of a situation. And because of that, I recognize when I see misdirection going on, whether it's from a politician, a clergy, or whoever. Let's see. I'm already getting a whole bunch of emails saying, oh, no, the World Trade Towers were brought down with micronukes and directed energy weapons. They used ray guns. They're just trying to jam with as much nonsense as possible because they are terrified the American people have come to understand 9/11 was indeed the new Pearl Harbor and just as phony as the Reichstag fire. And people are waking up to that. And so all the government can do is just throw junk out there like, oh, there was no plane at the Pentagon. It was flying saucers. It was the Hindenburg. It was whatever. To try and throw as much noise out there so the corporate media can say, wow, these 9/11 kooks, they don't know what they're talking about. And if you noticed, ever since they put out that no plane thing, anytime anybody in the corporate media is going to defend the official story, that's the first thing they go to. That's why that was put out there. Oh, those 9/11 kooks, they don't think there was actually a plane at the Pentagon. No, that's the government propagandists who are putting that stuff out there. And we recognize that's what they're doing, to give the media an easy handle to quell down critics or doubters of the official story. They won't talk about the controlled demolition of Building 7. It wasn't even in the official U.S. government report. That's how scared of it they are. That's why Richard Gage is doing such a public service, reminding America there was that third building that came down without explanation other than controlled demolition. And so they're already cranking up the propaganda machine to try and put out any wacko stuff that they can get. I'm already getting tons of emails saying, oh, it was this, it was that. They had the giant starship overhead and it actually beamed up the towers and beamed down wreckage and just all kinds of nonsensical stuff they're trying to put out there. Alrighty, let's see. Robert, hold on. We got to take a commercial break. I don't want to start you now and get you sort of built up to momentum here. So we got 4 callers waiting on the line. We're going to start taking calls as soon as we're back from these words from America. Welcome back to the show. And if you really want to be a pirate, you should go to work for the IRS. We're going to go back to the phones here. Robert in Missouri. Aloha, Robert. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. I wanted to piggyback on the 9/11 catastrophe operation, whatever you want to call it, is really a quintessential point in the world's history. And I really wanted to zero in on Building 7 and Larry Silverstein. I mean, this guy goes on PBS just after the events take place saying, well, we had such a tremendous loss of life. It was such a terrible blah, 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 that we just went ahead and decided to pull it. Mm-hmm. Using controlled demolition terminology, saying we decided to pull it. Okay, so if the fire started around 9 o'clock in the morning, 9:30 or whatever, and they pull the building just a few hours later, that must have been a really great controlled demolition team to get in there and wire that building so perfectly in just a couple of hours to make it fall in on its own footprint. Wouldn't you say?
Well, normally to rig a building for controlled demolition, even with a full crew, it'll take several weeks to do it properly. In the case where they're trying to make it not look like a controlled demolition, they probably could cut some corners. But there's a lot of argument about just what Silverstein meant when he said pull it, and of course we know he just made out like a bandit financially from this whole situation. When he took over control of the World Trade Center, everybody was asking, he had to be out of his mind because the entire facility was facing an EPA-mandated retrofit to remove all of the asbestos that had been used in the original construction. And other buildings in New York that had been forced to go through this renovation by the EPA had been driven into bankruptcy by it. So here you had Larry Silverstein coming in and just taking control of a facility which, had it been left untouched, was likely to sink his entire financial empire. And it doesn't seem like a very prudent and wise decision to do. And then all of a sudden, of course, 9/11 happens. The first responders clean up all the asbestos and inhale much of it into their lungs. And Larry Silverstein gets all this money from the insurance so he can build a whole new World Trade Tower. How very lucky for this gentleman here. But again, I think we need to stay focused on those aspects of 9/11 that are not open to possible interpretation, like what Larry meant by pull it. We just look at the very obvious evidence of controlled demolition, the fact that BBC and Fox and others reported on the collapse of Building 7 26 minutes before it actually happened, the evidence of thermite and cutter charges in the wreckage, and, of course, the very strange way the United States Secret Service Protective Detail just absolutely seemed to know that George Bush, sitting in that public school down in Florida, was not a target of an airplane crashing out of the sky. And again, the only way they could know that is they knew what the plan of operation for the day was.
How about, I was just happened to be watching one of my documentaries, because I've watched just about every one I could get my hands on. I just happened to be watching through one of them yesterday, where it went into Secretary Norman Minetta's testimony about being down in the emergency bunker with Vice President Cheney and the young Air Force guy saying, "Sir, the plane's so far out. Do the orders still stand?" And then Cheney whipping his head around, "Have I told you anything to the contrary?" Basically, I mean, that's the really sick stuff. And then don't forget about
that's a dead giveaway, because, the inference is the order was let the plane come on in. And that raises the larger question. Washington, D.C. and New York are some of the most heavily air-defended places on planet Earth, and yet all of the fighters that were normally there in New York had all been sent way up north as part of this ongoing NORAD exercise. I mean, they left the door wide open for this thing to happen. Remember how fast they got fighters on Payne Stewart's Learjet when it lost its cabin pressure and everybody on board died and the plane was just sort of wandering over the Midwest? They had fighters on that in less than 30 minutes, and yet these hijacked planes were allowed to wander all the way over the east part of the United States. Some of them flew out to Ohio before turning back and heading for New York and Washington, D.C. They flew over 8 United States Air Force bases, and not a single plane came up to check them out. Okay? All right, I think Robert hung up. We're going to switch over to Kyle in Pennsylvania. Aloha, Kyle. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Michael. 9/11 really is the fulcrum of the entire alternative news, or, everything that we go by. And why I say that is because to not know the reasons behind 9/11, it's understandable that people would have doubts about it being a false flag attack. But by the same token, if you don't believe 9/11 is a false flag attack, it's very difficult to believe to understand a lot of the other conspiracies, for lack of a better word, going on in our world. Mm-hmm. I think it was designed this way, and I find it hard to think that at any point it's going to be seen as the JFK assassination or the Gulf of Tonkin.
I disagree. I disagree. And, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It took about 30 years to reach the point where half of the population of America no longer trusted the Warren Report. That was 30 years. Look how quickly we achieved that same degree of disbelief and distrust following 9/11. I mean, the lifespan of a government cover-up these days can be clocked with an egg timer. And part of the reason is they run these operations by the same rules of propaganda that worked at the height of the Cold War, the 1950s and the 1960s, when we trusted the government and we were all brainwashed to soil ourselves when we heard the word commie. But those days are gone forever. I mean, the Iraq War is historic in the fact that we know virtually every war in history is started with a lie or a deception. But in the case of the Iraq War, the lie that started it, Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, became known to the general public while that war was still ongoing. And that's the first time in human history that's actually happened.
Yeah, but that is, I think a lot of people's perception has that confined to the Bush cabinet. And that's where it begins and ends for them. I think a lot of people put the Iraq War on George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Condoleezza Rice, and don't see the complicity past that. So they figure, okay, now that they're out of office, now that they're no longer, it's back to let's give our government the benefit of the doubt.
I would disagree with that. I think a lot of people are putting the blame for these ongoing wars firmly on Obama, because if you remember when Obama was campaigning for the White House, you remember this promise he made?
I will promise you this, that if we have not gotten our troops out by the time I am president, it is the first thing I will do. I will get our troops home. We will bring an end to this war. You can take that to the bank.
Okay, well, Obama's been the president for 5 years now, and the wars are continuing. And I think most Americans are smart enough to realize that if his campaign promise for the White House was to end these wars that we knew were illegal and based on lies, and he did not do it, then he is an accessory to these war crimes after the fact. And I think most Americans now understand that.
And everything that the man has said, everything that Obama has said,
yes,
we're running for election, has been a lie, straight down the line. I can probably count on one hand the amount of things that he promised and said that were true. But he still has that left cover who, you know, they're still making excuses and they're still blaming it on Bush. And
well, I know there's a cadre of his supporters in his inner circle, but general support among Democrats, general support among the black part of the population is cratering right now. That's why he's out campaigning right now. He's not even running for office. He's campaigning to save his job. He's going across the United States just trying to sell this idea that if we'll forget all about NSA spying and the IRS targeting of political dissidents, we'll forget about Benghazi and the rest of it, that he'll fudge the economic numbers to make it look like the economy's doing better, and nobody is buying that.
By the same token, I'll go back and say, as much as the Iraq war was put on Bush and his cabinet, I feel like a lot of these Benghazi, NSA, things like that, hate Obama and get placed on other people, i.e. Hillary Clinton, i.e. the CIA and the NSA, and for some reason,
I disagree. I mean, certainly I put the fault for Benghazi right firmly on Barack Obama and his re-election team that thought this stunt was going to work. We're going to let you go here. We're coming up on a commercial break. We got a lot of phone calls to get through before the top of the hour, and Ellen Brown joins us to talk about private central banking. So thank you very much, Kyle. We're going to let you go. When we come back from the next commercial break, we've got George, Kathleen, Kent, and Werner all waiting on the line. I'm going to try and get through all of you before the top of the hour. So bear with us. A lot of callers today, a lot of fun, a lot of good dialogue, and we'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. America, welcome back to the show. We're going to jam some phone calls in here, starting with George in Texas. Aloha, George. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, how you doing, Mike? You know, the thing is, Mike, I'm just getting sick and tired of some of these gloom and doomers in Patriot Radio saying that the public's not awake. And you know, the thing is, you look at this NSA scandal. Why did they put it out? Because if the NSA is watching all the American people trying to send a chilling effect, it's because the NSA is listening to all the phone conversations and find out we're all PO'd.
You want to know my opinion? I think a lot of these people who are calling into these shows and saying, oh, the American people are just never going to believe this, I think in many cases they're working for the government trying to discourage us. But again, the best way to get the measure of what the American people are believing or not is to go out on that human net and start talking to your friends and neighbors and coworkers, and you're going to find out that pretty much 90% of America is clued into what's going on right now.
Well, you know, the thing is, Mike, I kind of notice, you know, a lot of people awake, and, you know, I'm using the human net, and they don't talk much. They keep to themselves, and a lot are vocal, you know, but everybody responds differently, but but PO'd means PO'd either way.
Well, the more you all talk, the more you find that courage to speak out, the more you're going to give others around you the courage to speak out, and that is what is needed right now as we go on out. And we're at a point right now where the American people are taking control of the flow of information in our society. We're taking it away from government propagandists. We're taking it away from the corporate media. We, the people, are deciding what the news is and what we need to know.
We control the narrative. No longer the press or the government.
That's exactly right. We're in control of the narrative right now. We're going to switch over to Kathleen in Texas. Aloha, Kathleen. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Kathleen, are you there?
I just wanted to say, about 4 callers ago, I think his name is Chris, I'd like to reiterate what he said, that only God can keep us from lies and deception. But anyway, and I pray every day that that he will keep me from, not being cowardly to look at difficult issues, but then to see clearly. But the reason I called was to mention to the listeners that Ralph Winterow, who has a show on RBN on Sunday nights from 5 to 7, this coming Sunday night, he will have Judy Woods, who wrote the book "Where Did the Towers Go?" And I've heard her interviewed before, and it's always very entertaining and enjoyable.
Yeah, well, hang on. Okay, Judy Wood is one of the people who's out there pushing the directed energy laser beam theory. So she's part of the problem. She's out there pushing this very kooky theory that the corporate media and the government can use to say, oh, those wackos, they think the buildings were destroyed with ray guns. And she's getting a lot of press, but she's out there right alongside the no plane at the Pentagon people to try and kookify the discussion. Okay, we're going to switch over here to Kent in West Virginia. Aloha, Kent. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Kent, are you there?
Yeah, you're dead right. That Judy Wood lady is really, really bad news. It occurs to me that I've often thought that somehow if we could start an attack on people who deny, believe the government story, and actually attack them as being traitors and un-American.
No, that's counterproductive. It's counterproductive. Yeah. You cannot shove somebody over a bridge. You have to stand on the other side and invite them across. No, we're not attacking anybody. We're coming to the argument with facts, logic, and science, and we leave the attacking to the other side because that's what they do to us when they say, oh, they're kooks, they're wackos, they're aiding the enemy, and so forth. Thank you for the call. We're going to switch over to Werner in New Brunswick. Aloha, Werner. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Good afternoon, Mike. When I turned in, you were talking about building number 7.
Yes.
I happened to listen just a few days after 9/11 to Coast to Coast, and the guest that was on there was mentioning that a few weeks earlier, I think 2 or 3 weeks earlier, building number 7 had been powered down for about 3 days.
Yeah, the entire World Trade Center was. The 2 towers in Building 7 were all shut down, which meant all of the security systems were shut off. All of the video cameras that were on recorders were all shut down.
Yeah, and what I understand in building number 7, that's where the administration of the pension funds for the Ivy University for the professors was located, to the tune of, I understood, about $350 billion.
Oh, there was a lot of stuff in that building number 7 because it housed all these government offices. All of the major fraud cases being investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission against Wall Street were in that building and conveniently destroyed. There was actually a bullion vault in the basement of World Trade Center 7. When the demolition crew, when the cleanup crew finally got down here, that vault had been emptied mysteriously just ahead of the collapse. CIA had offices in there with investigations into terror. Those were all destroyed. It's always amazing when a building comes down and very damaging information just conveniently happens to be in it. And I'll give you another example, and that would be the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. When that was brought down in what is clearly also another false flag attack, all of the evidence regarding the FBI and BATF's crimes at Waco, Texas, against that church full of women and children. Congress was screaming for an investigation because the American people were outraged, and the FBI had collected all of the evidence together, and they put it in the Oklahoma City Federal Building, even though the incident took place in Texas and the investigation was in Washington, D.C. For some reason, all the evidence was stored in the Murrah Building. Oh, my goodness, the building came down, the evidence is gone, we can't have an investigation now.
And oh my goodness, the part where the whatever it was went into the Pentagon, that's where there all the files about the missing $2.3 trillion.
Yeah, that's right. When that airplane slammed into the Pentagon, it flew around the Pentagon and came in from the other side, and it hit the accounting offices trying to find where that $2.3 trillion had vanished that Donald Rumsfeld had announced just the day before. Should have been the financial military scandal of the decade, but just how lucky Donald Rumsfeld was 24 hours later. Planes are crashing into buildings, erasing the accounting files, and the media, of course, immediately forgot about that missing volume of cash from the Pentagon. And it wasn't just 2.3. There'd been an earlier scandal where another trillion went missing. So it was over $3 trillion of U.S. tax money vanished from within the Pentagon, and the evidence where it went was destroyed on 9/11. Werner, got to let you go. Going to fit in one more call before top of the hour. Fred in North Carolina. Aloha, Fred. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Love your show, and thanks for taking the call. I got a couple of points. One, I want to remember you the EP-3 incident where some Chinese fighters took the lift away from an EP-3 reconnaissance plane there next to China. It is obvious that the Army always knows what is possible. Now we're going back to 911, and it turns out that fighters were launched, and the excuse was we have no ammunition on board, we cannot bring a plane down. Yes, they could. The Army had learned. EP-3 was the example how to bring a plane down if you don't have ammunition.
Well, the problem is, and I'm sorry to cut you off here because we're almost at the end of the show here, the problem on 9/11 wasn't that planes did or did not have ammunition or missiles. It's that all of the planes that would have been in position to intercept were out of position. They were up in the central United States as part of the drill. There were actually fighters launched that were sent way out over the Atlantic Ocean before they were allowed to turn back, which meant they were too far away to prevent the strikes in New York. I mean, it's very obvious what was going on. This was allowed to happen, and this gets back to, of course, what Dick Cheney was saying in the White House Situation Room. The orders still stand as the plane kept coming in and coming in and coming into the Pentagon. They wanted this to happen. The Project for the New American Century stated right in their policy paper, Rebuilding America's Defenses, that their plan for a new militarized America was not going to work absent a new Pearl Harbor. This was set up to turn the United States into a war machine to conquer the world and bring them back to Bretton Woods and the petrodollar. And it's failing miserably, but they can't quit. Got to take a break for news and commercials. Back with Ellen Brown after these words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, and we're still trying to connect with Ellen Brown to talk about her books and everything. And I guess there's some difficulty in reaching her. Okay, well, we'll just keep on going with the show then, and if we don't get her, we will reschedule her. But as of my last email communication with her this morning, she was standing by for the... we got her! We got her! There we are. The phones are working there. Joining us on the air now, I've been looking forward to this for a very, very long time, is Ellen Brown, who's the author of many books, Web of Debt, The Public Banking Solution, and gee, Ellen, what on earth should we be talking about today?
Well, that's a good question. There are many things. I just read an article on the San Francisco Citibank can now move forward. They had what appeared to be a legal roadblock, but that's been dissolved. But there are also so many other interesting things. Detroit, I think, is the bail-in template for bankrupt cities. It's going the same way with the banks are going to make off with the money, and the pensioners are going to get robbed.
And what's really weird is, as I understood the bankruptcy laws before, employees and pensioners and small people were supposed to be at the head of the line, and bondholders were at the rear because it was assumed they've already got money. Their lives are not going to be seriously disrupted by getting cheated out of the money that's owed to them. The real harm is obviously employees and pensioners whose lives could be absolutely ruined by losing that money. But the bankers, the money junkies, they just want to go on grabbing all of that stuff. And I've been hearing more and more talk about how they're going to go to the taxpayers to bail out Detroit. But the problem with Detroit is the taxpayers they have couldn't pay those tax bills. So this idea they're just going to come on out and start taxing Americans more. We know that Obama's out there talking about having a 40% tax rate on small businesses. Yes, let's drive all the small businesses out of business, even though they're responsible for 2/3 of all new job creation. But it all comes down to a simple reality. And then I'm going to let you talk unmolested here. The government can go on saying raise taxes, carbon taxes, new all the rest of that stuff, Obamacare taxes coming on. Corporations can say we're going to raise prices on stuff. But you've reached a point in this country where there is simply no more money out here to be had. and we've got this entire governmental structure and banking structure that is totally focused on how to get more wealth out of the people, and nobody is paying attention how to get the wealth into the hands of the people in order to make all those payments. How do we give the people the ability to transform their labor into real wealth that can be used to hold up this giant pyramid that is sitting on top of them? And so for all the talk about bailing out Detroit with more tax revenues, the money just isn't out here any longer. This whole pyramid is starting to collapse. So, Ellen, let's back up to Web of Debt, because in that book you say a lot of things that I'm in agreement with regarding the inherent failings of private central banking, about how it was never designed to serve the public, the community, the nation, that it was all about serving itself.
Right, and that is the basic problem, that the way our banking system is set up, our money system is set up, there is never enough money in the hands of the people. There can't be enough money because virtually all of our money today comes into the money supply through the banks as loans. They do it by double entry bookkeeping, so they actually create the money on their books that they lend, and they always inevitably ask for more money back than they put out there, because that's principal plus interest. They don't create the interest, they just create the principal. That's one problem. Then you have the basic problem, which is basic social credit, that C.H. Douglas pointed out nearly a century ago, that all producers expect to make a profit, and so they pay their workers and materials costs and the interest and et cetera, all the things they pay as costs. Then they add some percentage for their own profits, and then they set their price at that. Well, they didn't put the money out there to cover that extra percentage that is their profit, and that is the interest, et cetera. So there's not enough money in the system to buy our own GDP. So the products that the workers make, they can't buy. I mean, collectively, there's not enough money out there to buy the products that workers make, because the price is always higher than what they got paid. So somewhere new money has to come into the system. It used to be, well, like during the colonial times, is what I've written about in Web of Debt, that we used to have a system where it was the government that created the money. These are the colonies, and they all issued money. We had a different concept of money then. Money was basically receipts for labor or goods or materials, goods or services delivered to the government. So it was a receipt that represented the credit of the colony or the province, and it circulated. These were scrip, paper scrip, and they circulated as money among the colonists, and then they were accepted back in the payment of taxes.
And it was a balanced system. But when you have these private central banks that usurp the money creation authority, the instant that first Federal Reserve note went into circulation, more money is owed to the private bank than actually exists, and the situation can never be reversed.
Right, unless we get some more money out there in some other way.
Well, they'll be happy to loan it to you.
Yeah, well, that's it. You need to have some that's not lent. So either the government has to print some money, which everybody hits the roof because they think that's going to be hyperinflationary, but it won't because there isn't enough money out there. Or the government needs to borrow from its own government-owned and controlled central bank. In other words, a central bank that's designed to serve the economy and the people, not designed to serve the banks. Borrow from the central bank interest-free, which has been done many times before. It's been done in New Zealand and Canada. I've written about all this in Public Bank Solution. I looked at all the public systems globally. Well, not all of them. There's still more out there. It was amazing. I spent a lot, 4 or 5 years on this book, and there's still more out there. 40% of banks globally are publicly owned, it turns out. And then historically, there's a long history of public banking, but it's always bumped up against private banking, and it's sort of a rule that the crooks always win because they cheat. And
well,
so
not always. I mean, we fought the American Revolution to be free of the private central Bank of England, and the good guys won on that one, only to have subsequent American governments sell us back into that same form of slavery, not once but 3 times. And we talk a lot about the history of the first and second banks of the United States, and those few presidents willing to stand up to the crooks at great risk to their their persons. But I'm a little surprised to hear that 40% of the banks are publicly owned. I think that's a very healthy sign, because a lot of times we're hearing about how virtually, we're down to just a few nations left on earth that don't have a private central bank in charge of the money creation. And it's possible. We demonstrated this in the early United States. You can have a government-issued currency that isn't accruing interest, and you can have banking, which loans money out of deposits at interest, coexisting side by side, and it's a naturally stable system. But when the bankers take over the public currency and trade and transform it from being a public utility to another money-making venture, that's an inherently unstable system, which leads to this cycle of boom and bust and trying to solve the economic mess by getting into a world war.
Right. Actually, most central banks are publicly owned, but they're privately controlled. That's a problem. Like the Bank of England is technically owned by the government, and most of them are technically owned by the government. Actually, the Federal Reserve is one of the few that is owned by a collection of private bankers, and those are all the 12 Federal Reserve branches are all privately owned by the banks in their district. But that's actually an unusual model. However, they're virtually all members of the Bank for International Settlements, which sets the rules, which requires what they call financial sustainability, which they define, they define it as
okay, Ellen, I'm going to cut you off here.
A limited amount of money out there.
We've got to take a break here for commercial. Stay on the line. When we come back, I want to talk about that idea of sustainability and whether it's an illusion or not. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're speaking with economist Ellen Brown, who's authored several books on the design failings of privately controlled central banking, the alternative system of public banking, as a solution to return the public currency to being a public utility instead of serving private interests. We're talking about how all of these privately controlled central banks around the world are following rules laid down by the International Bank of Settlements that controls how much currency is allowed out into the public. In other words, they're deciding how much money your society is going to have to try and carry on commerce. And of course, that decision is never made in terms of optimizing commerce and improving the lives of people. It's always with an eye to maximizing debt, which maximizes profitability. And all of these private central banks have the same failing, which is that the instant you start loaning money into circulation, that society, that government owes more money to the bank than is actually in existence. And they can, yes, borrow more money to pay part of that interest, but then they owe interest on that. And it carries that accumulating debt forward, and this is why all these countries on the books are trillions and trillions of dollars or euros into debt, and all of that debt is really money that never existed to begin with, and that is the trap. There's a wonderful movie out called The International. Didn't get a lot of press for obvious reasons, and there's this wonderful quote that's inside there. I think I have it here in my little cart machine here, where, here we are.
The IBBC is a bank. Their objective isn't to control the conflict. It's to control the debt that the conflict produces. You see, the real value of a conflict, the true value, is in the debt that it creates. You control the debt, you control everything. You find this upsetting, yes? But this is the very essence of the banking industry, to make us all, whether we be nations or individuals, slaves to debt.
It is the very essence of the banking industry, to make us all, whether we be nations or individuals, slaves to debt, even if the debt is created out of thin air on a ledger. Ellen, take the microphone.
Wow, great quote. I love that. That's true. I have to correct myself. It's not financial sustainability; it's stability that the BIS has set as their goal, or that all central banks should be aiming for. And what they should be aiming for is sustainability, because what they have now is not sustainable.
It's not even stable. It's not even stable.
Yeah, right.
It's a pyramid. It's a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, our central bank has set itself the goals of full employment and financial stability. We've never had virtually never had either one. So they failed. They've never reached their goal, and they're not even. It looks like they're not even looking at full employment now.
No, they aren't, and I'm tired of all these bailouts. I mean, we're constantly being told by the government that the way to preserve the integrity and trustworthiness of the American banking system is we're going to take $1 trillion from the American people and we're going to give it to the banks so the banks can turn around and loan it back to the people at interest. And I think most Americans realize that's a raw deal.
Yeah, I saw an article on why was it that we bailed out the banks, but we didn't bail out Detroit. And supposedly it's because the banks are systemically risky. In other words, systemically important. If the banks go down, the whole financial system goes down because it's also unstable. Whereas Detroit is no big deal. If Detroit goes down, it doesn't hurt the financial system. Well, maybe not, but if Detroit goes down, first of all, it hurts not just their pensioners. Their pensioners are going to get wiped out. But that is the template. That's what they're planning to do with all these cities, Chicago, et cetera. They're all this close to bankruptcy. And once Detroit does it, they're all going to do it. And I mean, that was actually in The Economist, the London Economist. They had a cover story on that there was going to be a domino effect after Detroit went down. And
absolutely,
they're going to totally ruin the bond market because they're no longer guaranteeing the bonds the way they used to. So nobody's going to want to buy those bonds. I mean, they're already not wanting to buy bonds of other cities in Michigan because they figure they're all bankrupt or they will be or they're all going the way of Detroit. They just don't trust the market anymore. So if nobody buys the bonds, where do they get the money? So here is where public banks come in. If we could talk them into setting the things up. If you have your own bank, you can create, here's how Bank of North Dakota does it, our one and only publicly owned bank. All of the state revenues go into the Bank of North Dakota. Now they have X amount of deposits, and they're allowed to create that sum in credit. So let's say you get in all your state deposits, which is a lot, and then you issue that sum in credit. What are you going to do with the credit? Well, what you could do is actually buy up your municipal bonds at 0% interest because you own the bank. You're going to get all the interest back. You don't care about the market, about the rating agencies and, the bond vigilantes and all those things that you don't need interest rate swaps. You don't need to protect your interest rate. You have no interest rate. You own the bank. And that is a lot of credit power that you can generate. I mean, look at what California could do. If California had its own bank, it has, now I've forgotten the numbers, but anyway, it's got many times what North Dakota has in the way of assets. It's got like $200 billion over $200 billion in the pension fund. It's got $70 billion in the treasury.
Can I ask you a question? It sounds to me like under this public banking model, and I'm presuming the same laws apply to the public banks as the private banks, this is a case where the fractional reserve system is actually going to play to the advantage of the public because for every, say, $1,000 in tax revenues deposited in that public bank, they're allowed to create some multiple of that as a credit line. So they would effectively have $8,000 in credit in this public bank to put out there at zero interest if they felt like it to support public development. Am I correct in that, or am I smoking opium here?
Well, that's actually, it's the capital that gets leveraged. So if you take $1 million in capital, you can create $10 million in credit. Mm-hmm. But that's great because you can easily get the deposits. Even if you don't have the deposits, here's what banks do. As soon as they get in a loan, they actually create the deposits on their books, which is the loan. Like you ask for a loan, they'll write up the loan as an asset to themselves on one side of their books, and then they'll write it up as a liability to themselves on the other side of their books because that's the money they're going to put in your deposit account. So they have just created this deposit account. Then when the money goes to clear, when it goes through the Federal Reserve or whatever clearing system they're using, then you have to move reserves from your bank to another bank. But if you don't have the reserves, the Federal Reserve automatically just counts it as an overdraft on your reserve account, and you can borrow it. So you can borrow that money from other banks at currently the Fed funds rate is 0.25%. So in other words, instead of borrowing at these exorbitant rates that municipal governments are now having to borrow at, you can borrow at 0.25% for whatever you need. Or if you can't get it from the other banks, if they're, for some reason they don't feel like lending it to you or they don't have it, then you can get it from the Fed at 0.75%. That's what Elizabeth Warren is saying, that they should, if the Fed can lend to any bank at that rate, why can't they lend to the students at the same rate? Or you can go to the money market. I mean, there are many sources. So anyway, you can borrow much more cheaply, and you can effectively raise your deposit base. You can have what's called broker deposits. In other words, you buy the deposit.
All right,
so
we've got
the capital that actually is leveraged.
Ellen, we got to take another break here for 4 minutes. We'll be right back after these words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with economist Ellen Brown, and it is quite enlightening here. And I want to go back and recap on something. I'm always talking about this idea of the public currency as a public utility, there to serve commerce, the community, and it sounds to me, if I understand what you're saying correctly, our present banking system as it is situated would actually serve that model of public currency as public utility if the banks themselves are handled as a public utility rather than for-profit corporations. So the difference between the predations of a privately owned, privately controlled bank and the public bank is simply that the money junkies who are trying to run this system for their own immense wealth are simply taken out of the equation, and nothing else really needs to change. Would I be correct?
You need to have all public banks. Like in North Dakota, most of the banks are private, but the Bank of North Dakota partners with the local banks, and it guarantees their loan. So it's a little bit like you've contracted out to private entities the actual dealing with the customer and, you know, checking their credit worthiness, all that sort of thing. But the center of it is public, and it's controlled by the public interest, and so it's run for the public interest. So you don't have derivatives, you don't have proprietary trading, you don't have all these very risky things that are throwing off the system. For example, Bank of America is hardly making personal loans anymore, or commercial, local, small business loans. What they're doing is gambling and derivatives because they can make more money at it.
Yeah, they absolutely are.
They're a private company.
I want to clarify something I said. We're not talking about privately owned banks like your bank down here at the end of the street and it's privately owned. That's not an issue. The issue is when you get banks, well, like the Federal Reserve System, that have the money creation authority. And as you say, they've got so much money, they're getting into this gambling mentality. They've turned Wall Street from its original purpose of allowing American workers to share in the productivity of American industry into this giant open-air casino. We know that much of what we're dealing with today goes back to 1999 and the repeal of Glass-Steagall. And even though very clearly Glass-Steagall should be reimposed, we still have people like John McCain out there saying, oh, no, the financial industry can manage itself. And I'm sure that they do, but the financial industry is only thinking about the financial industry. And certainly that's demonstrated by this hue and cry to basically cheat Americans out of their pensions. We know that Social Security taxes were raised in the 1980s in anticipation of the baby boomer retirements. Then the Clinton administration looted that money, spent it as general revenues. That's where they got their federal budget surplus. So now they're talking about having to cut Social Security, raise the retirement age. Now they're talking about forcing people to liquidate their own private retirement accounts, their 401ks, their IRAs, and purchase yet another special government treasury bond. And it just seems like they're just trying to shove this disaster off onto the next administration or the next Congress, but they really don't have a solution. And very often I look at the state of the banking system, and I'm not a banking expert. You know, you can tell that looking at my own checking account. If the check register matches the bank statement, I call a press conference. But it seems to me like modern banking isn't really a science. It's just another religion. It's an arbitrary set of rules that we are taught to believe represent something real that are set up to benefit the clergy, in this case, the bankers. And we know that banking does serve a valid community purpose in terms of pooling the resources of the community to fund companies and institutions and facilities that will benefit the community, but we also know that some seriously ill people, money junkies, are drawn to the leadership of those banks in order to basically say, I want to have more money than the guy sitting in the office across the street. And that is really very destabilizing. And again, Washington, D.C. seems to have completely abandoned even the pretense of standing as an arbiter between the greed of the financial corporations and the needs of the rest of society as a whole. And I think that's a major reason why we're seeing things go downhill so fast.
Yeah, agreed. A major objection to reinstating Glass-Steagall, the opponents say, well, that would not have prevented the 2008 collapse because Lehman Brothers was an investment bank. They didn't have depositors, and they still went down, and they took the system down with it. But, okay, fine, it wouldn't have prevented the 2008 collapse, but we're looking at something totally different now. We now have those investment banks turned into depository banks, and we have particularly Bank of America and J.P. Morgan Chase directly commingling their proprietary trading arm with their depository arms. So, and we the people, we the depositors, as soon as we put our money in the bank, it becomes the money of the bank. Most people don't realize that. Mm-hmm. And what we have is an IOU. So we become creditors of the bank. We become unsecured creditors of the bank. So when they gamble in their derivatives deals and they lose, they're going to take all the money in the pot. They'll say, well, that's our money. It's all there in the pool. We know we owe you the money. Well, sorry, we're bankrupt. So now we're going to go through we're going to go through the bail-in so that we won't have to go bankrupt because we are systemically important and you can't let us go bankrupt. So you have to bail us in because the government's not going to bail us out anymore. So that means we're going to take the depositors.
Well, we saw already over in Cyprus, they were calling it a haircut. It's actually more like a scalping. I think it's up to 47% of the deposits there. We know that all across Europe, they're now looking at depositor bail-ins to cover the bank losses. It's in Canada's financial plan for next year to have bail-ins. Whether you call it a haircut or a scalping or an outright castration, this is the new business model. And ultimately, in the long run, because this style of banking always produces more debt than money with which to pay that debt, it has to collapse sometime. And the goal of our current very fascist economic thinking is to allow the people who've gotten rich on Wall Street to keep their money and to transfer the losses onto the American people, which is where we get TARP and bailout and quantitative easing infinity. And it's just all geared to basically suck the remaining real wealth out of the American public, out of the pension funds, and just put it into the pockets of these money junkies. And I realize that not everybody who wants to be rich is a money junkie. Some people get rich by simply coming out with a good product like Steve Jobs, or make good movies like James Cameron or George Lucas. I'm talking about people who game the system, who corrupt the political structure in order to simply set up the system in such a way that wealth flows to them and for which nothing of any real value is returned to society. And I think what's reassuring for me listening to your description is that the actual mechanics of the American banking system don't have to be changed. We just need to basically pull that private greed, profit motive out of the hierarchy and return the public banking and public currency to being public utilities. We need to reverse this trend of privatization of what should be the property of the people. The currency of a nation is supposed to be the property of the people and not the property of private bankers who will then loan it to you at interest. That's how this nation was set up. And sadly, though, we have had a government which is corruptible and is corrupted, and 3 times they traded us back into the slavery of these private bankers. I remember when Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, he wrote in his own diary years later, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my own nation." And he absolutely knew what was going on, because as a student of American politics and history, he'd remembered the abuses of the First Bank of the United States, how Congress' refusal to renew the charter of the First Bank of the United States led to the War of 1812, which in turn forced the government to accept the Second Bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson succeeded in shutting that down, at which point they tried to shoot him. And so we're seeing the entire history of the United States of America as a war between public banking, which would serve the people in the community, and these private central bankers, which are absolutely convinced that the only purpose to allow the American people to be alive is to be slaves to this artificially created debt. It's a really messed up system, but I think most Americans are finally picking up on the fact that the economy and the banking system is not set up to serve the community and the people. It is set up to harvest labor and wealth and put it in the pockets of people whose only investment in the system is ink and paper.
Yep, agreed. And the whole idea of regulating the banks, the big banks, it obviously doesn't work. Dodd-Frank is full of loopholes. It is actually endorsing the bail-in system, basically. And the big banks are bigger than they've ever been. It seems to me that they will always find a way around the rules when you impose rules. There's this huge shadow banking system that's not even subject to the rules. It doesn't have deposits, so it doesn't have reserve requirements or capital requirements.
Okay, we got to take another break for commercials. I'm sorry to cut you off, Ellen. We do have to pay bills around here. 4-minute break, and we'll be back finishing up with Ellen Brown after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America, and welcome back to the show here. We're finishing up with economist Ellen Brown. She's got a lot of good books out there going into very fine detail about just how it is that these privately controlled central banks have usurped the money creation authority, originally vested in the public by the Constitution, for their own personal gain. And if you're familiar with my article and video, All Wars Are Bankers' Wars, these money junkies have a demonstrated history of being willing to send hundreds of millions of people to death and disfigurement to keep their little scam going. The solution is public banking. The public currency and the banking system as a public utility there to serve the community and its people. We're always talking about the blueprint for the new America, what kind of a nation we want to set up on this country when the current one is finished collapsing, which it seems inevitable is about to happen. And rule number 1, no private central banks. Rule number 2, no private central banks. Rule number 3, no private central banks, and we'll come up with the rest of the rules later. Ellen, is there anything you want to share with our listeners before we let you go?
Well, I would say rule number 4 might be to get rid of all those systemically rich. I mean, those are private banks, and they're not central banks, but they are essentially, we're supporting them. I mean, they cannot go bankrupt. That's what this whole bail-in thing is about. It's like no matter what, these banks have to survive. Even cross borders, that's what the bail-in policies are about.
Oh,
like
yeah.
A bank in London could go bankrupt, and we in the U.S. are going to have to bail them out with this whole, because they are international banks.
Well, it's also the derivatives. That's the reason the Federal Reserve is sending a huge amount of this quantitative easing over to the banks of Europe to keep them solvent, because when any of those banks in Europe collapse, there's going to be a firestorm of derivatives coming due on Wall Street. And they can't keep this system going much longer. It's just so intercrossed with all of these high-risk ventures. We know they're playing fast and loose with the bullion. Anyway, I don't mean to talk over you here, but this is your time to share your websites and your books and other information with our listeners.
No, I love how you talk. I mean, you're quite exciting to talk with. Yeah, but I just lost my train of thought. So with these big banks, they need to be separated out from our deposits. That's the thing. If we can guarantee our deposits, but we shouldn't be guaranteeing their derivatives. So we need Glass-Steagall. And another thing I think we definitely need is to get rid of that super priority and bankruptcy thing where the derivatives go first in bankruptcy. Why? The same reason. They're supposedly systemically risky. Like, they're so intertwined. I mean, the whole structure, this whole 600 trillion or 1.2 quadrillion, however you want to count it, this whole structure of derivatives is so fragile that if you pull one little stick out, the whole thing's going to go down. And therefore, all the derivatives get the money first. That means they are going to go for this big our deposits. They're going to get all that collateral first. The state and local governments, which think they're protected because they're secured creditors, which means they think they've got security backing all their deposits, there's not going to be any security left for them because the derivatives claims are much bigger than the state and local claims. so we have to separate those two systems out. It's so obvious that the system is going down. I mean, it's very vulnerable. There will be another crash, just like the last one.
Mm-hmm.
What we want to do is set up some sort of system where we're not going to be in it. Let them crash without us going down with them. And so that would mean, A, getting rid of that super priority and bankruptcy for derivatives. That was supposedly to protect this vulnerable fledgling industry called derivatives back in the 90s when Alan Greenspan was saying, well, our banks need, they need the money, they need the business, they need something to keep them going.
Don't you just love living under a government that views banks as more important than its own citizens? These are just buildings with brick and marble out front, and somehow they're held in higher regard by the government than the American people. I think that's a little psychotic. And the bottom line is there isn't enough wealth on earth to cover that derivatives exposure. It's all made-up numbers on a ledger. And so what is somebody going to come in and say, I've got all these derivatives, I now own planet Earth, and you all have to work for me for the rest of human history? And again, it is rule by debt. And it's really no more a legitimate form of governance than rule by divine right or rule by chattel ownership of your person, meaning slavery. It functions only so long as people are brainwashed into believing that this represents something real, that these numbers on a ledger of debt, money owed that never even existed, is something real. And it isn't. It isn't science. It's a religion, and it is simply another form of governance, and it is illegitimate because the only legitimate form of governance is self-governance, where the government is there to do for the community what the community needs but cannot do for itself. What we have now here is very clearly economic fascism, and they're trying to impose it on the rest of the planet by force of U.S. arms.
Yep, agreed. And that whole idea of them owning everything and we're working for them, that is an actual goal. It was in the Bilderberger meeting of, I don't remember, in the 1950s or something, some man named Ball said that the goal was the world company, that this handful of wealthy financiers would basically own the world and we would be working for them. And they actually thought that this would be better because democracies are so chaotic and you really can't trust the people to make good decisions, and that they would then be in charge. But we can just see from these interlocking banks, the LIBOR scandal is just one of a number of things in which they have colluded. They are really one bank. They are really one system, one private system that is growing larger and larger like this huge parasite on our economy, sucking out our money and making us slaves to them.
It's a return to feudalism. I mean, the American dream was the people would own the land. This return to feudalism is the land owns the people. You will not be allowed to leave the lordship's property without the leave of the Lord. They really are trying to take us back to feudalism and serfdom, and we're going to have to basically stand up, poke them in the nose, and say, no, you don't own me. You don't really own anything. You've concocted this illusion called banking under a set of rules that says over time eventually you will own it all, but we don't believe anymore. We're banking heretics. We will choose for ourselves what kind of an economic system we will have in our nation to benefit the nation and its people. And I think the one positive note we can look at is that in their rush to build this giant global fascist banking cartel, they've literally brought the world to the edge of a global revolution. And whereas in the past, when one nation with a privately controlled central bank would collapse or be subject to revolution, the other nations with privately controlled central banks would leap in to restart the scam, we could actually see the entire global network of privately controlled central banks collapse at the same time. And should that happen, we, the people of planet Earth, need to be ready to stand up and say, we are not restarting that scam. We are going to have the public currency and public banks as a public utility, and you money junkies are just going to have to go and make do with your monopoly sets from now on.
Right, and we have to at least be ready. If we don't actually have public banks in place, or a better system that we can move over to in place, we have to understand what we need to move over into. So when it does collapse, which is looking likely these days, we can do like Argentina did. We can issue our own money. We can tell the the creditors to go away. We'll think about paying you later.
Absolutely,
and,
absolutely.
As they said to the IMF, and then you can generate a national currency. You can generate on the local level. You can pay with warrants or any form of sort of IOUs.
Well, in short, I hate to cut you off because we're at the end of the show, but in short, anybody who stands up and says, let's start that privately owned, privately controlled central bank scam again, should be tarred, feathered, hanged, drawn, quartered, burned, and the ashes peed on by a rabid dog. I mean, we have to be that firm in saying we have endured this slavery for 100 years.
Can I say my website?
Yes, real quick.
Okay, webofdebt.com, publicbanksolution.com, and publicbankinginstitute.org.
And they are linked to whatreallyhappened.com so that you can go in and take a look at that. Ellen, love to have you back in the future. We got to make way for our next host. We're going to be back here tomorrow on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay angry, stay skeptical. Make good choices about what's going on. The time to be polite and restrained is over. It's time to get angry and scream about everything that's gone wrong with this country. Aloha, America.